What's going on, boys? Thanks to our patrons and Fiverr customers, subscribe to our Patreon free for behind the scenes stuff, arm yourselves, typology stuff. I think this will be another brief one. INTPs need experience. And it's not strictly for the disappearing up your own behind, and I can't say what I mean here because we haven't crossed the 30-second mark. Okay, here we go. Disappearing up your own ass or developing expectations about reality that are totally alien from reality prevention. INTPs need experience so you can disappear up your own ass. Because when your ass is fed adequately, it's not a bad place to have your head stuck up. But to get to that place and to maintain it, you need constant exposure to reality and people. Now, what am I talking about specifically? We're referencing, you could call it INTP intuition, or maybe TI intuition, but what we're really talking about is the intuition that arises from all of an INTP's functions in this order, thanks to acute, refined pattern recognition. Now, we talk about one of TI's superpowers, the ability to smell when something is wrong or you think is incorrect, even if you haven't or aren't presently able to put it into words, or you wouldn't be able to do the long math on it, but you know something is wrong. Now, that's a great power, that's a superpower, because what's happening here is you can smell the structural integrity of a puzzle without needing to go into the puzzle right now. You will need to do that at some point to be absolutely sure, or preemptively if you want to be absolutely sure before you take any actions. But this ability comes from TI, NE, and SI all working together, and FE too, because social puzzles are the most important ones, and you'll need FE if you want to smell your way through those. Now, instead of using a structural example, let's return to something that I like bringing up every so often because it's helped me in life. Heartbeat sounds. In an EMT context. An EMT isn't a blooded doctor. An EMT isn't a heart surgeon. And not all calls are related to the heart. So why should an EMT always listen to heart sounds? Because hearts functioning normally, functioning correctly, sound a certain way. So when you hear a heart that does not sound the way the last 900 hearts you've listened to have sounded, you might not know what the problem is specifically, but you know it's related to the heart because it doesn't sound right. And that's part of this INTP intuition. We look at things like puzzles. A thing is never just a thing, it is a collection of things stuck together in particular ways at particular times. And SI is a beautiful function. ISTPs have their own form of this, but once again, with them, it's always different. If both types are equally experienced, an ISTP will miss things that the INTP finds to be obvious, but within a few select spheres, an ISTP will not just understand the puzzle totally, they'll be able to understand the puzzles within the puzzles within the puzzles. Same principle, operating in a completely different way. INTPs, on the other hand, as we're dealing with these puzzles day after day after day, the same puzzles usually, we begin to develop a sense of the way things fit together, or the way things play out. And also, when things go wrong, probably what went wrong, and if you've been doing it long enough, maybe why, and what can be done about it. INTPs are great troubleshooters. Because even in spaces we probably shouldn't, quotes, be looking at things this way, we do, because you can, and you're kind of stupid for trying to turn that sense off. If you know it's there, you can access it, and it'll be advantageous to you. You develop that puzzle sense. First for one thing, then for another thing, until you reach the point you know this thing so well, you don't need to see the entire picture in with all of its particulars to have a pretty good idea, if not exactly what's gone wrong, then at least that something has gone wrong. Solely because, like the heartbeat sounds, it doesn't sound right, or it doesn't smell right. And to add, the reason we call this INTP intuition, why it's so important to think of this as a wet process, is these things are not always, rarely are, cut and dry. The reason you need that sense is because you can't put every step of everything into words at all times, even if potentially you could. But an additional difficulty to this is, while we might be able to understand the puzzles and a good number of the pieces, we know where everything is supposed to go, we still might not totally understand one of the pieces, why it is. We just know that in this configuration it's supposed to go here. So dumb shit INTPs call it logic, but then you'll run into situations you know something, but you can't put it into words, or when you try, it doesn't sound very logical. Does that detract from your certainty that this is right? Does it detract from your results when things go the way you know they're going to go? Because you know it? Actually, that's supposed to be another part of the video, but that'll build into the end, so we will go on this tangent. If you said yes, it does detract from your certainty, good. To an extent, it should. As an INTP, you're running a huge risk at all times. Even if you're working against it at all times, you're still risking big things. A consequence of dominant TI is, if you've never seen something not work the way you've learned it should work, then you risk overconfidence. And it's not, with INTPs, it's not a slow and insidious killer. Because the way INTPs operate, I think I've said it before, we don't, or rarely do we, when it's game time, feel our way through things or make decisions on the fly. It seems more like we try to set everything up in perfect alignment based on all the research we've done leading up to this moment. So, when we pull the trigger, the bullet will fly 3 miles and hit exactly the person we want it to, exactly where we want it to, exactly when we want it to. That's the preference. Or if you want a less extreme version of that example, INTPs who don't know how to swim would really prefer it if you didn't just throw them into the water out of nowhere. INTP info hunger is not a quirky, manic pixie dream girl thing. I'm a sponge for knowledge. That's not what's going on here. It's like we're trying to build an understanding of the world in a LiDAR-type fashion using information. We can't see something, and we're afraid of doing something, or we're uneasy about doing something, unless we understand as much about the way it's supposed to work as we can. Supposed to work is the key word there. So when an INTP is not getting accurate reads of reality, they're LiDAR scanning their own brain, they will, with total confidence, walk off a cliff and then blame the planet for their falling. Stupid. That's why or one of the reasons why INTPs need experience on the preventative side, you can't make good decisions on assumptions alone. And I'm sure dumb shit viewers, other types, obsessed with morality and what people tell them they're supposed to think, maybe less evolved, less patrician INTPs, they hear that and they clap because that's what you're supposed to say. That's the lesson you're supposed to learn. That you can't operate on assumptions alone. And they're right, you can't. The part people, I think, won't like hearing is, as an INTP, if you want to remove your limiters, do some fucking limit break shit, that's exactly what you need to return to. Operating mostly off assumptions. And even if you don't want to do that, as an INTP, you'll be doing it anyway. It's involuntary. The question is, how dedicated to the game are you? This is planeswalker shit. You need a constant stream of exposure to reality, to experience with reality, people also, in an almost weather vane fashion. Because I think, as an INTP, when you're getting your feet underneath you, your goal is to try to figure out the code of all things. At some point, you learn that's impossible, but there are, in return for the death of that dream, you receive knowledge of the far reaches you hadn't even considered, and you can't just go there. You need to predict your way or pattern your way into these things. But because there's no unified code of reality, what you need constant exposure to reality for is so you can keep a constant read on what the universe is doing. Because if you try to build a solid bridge into the unknown, the world will shift underneath you and it'll fall. Reality hates you. It doesn't like what you are. And it can fuck with you. It will fuck with you. I don't remember which sci-fi universe it is. I feel like it's Dune, but I'm not sure. But to navigate through space, you can't just chart a course. You need to chart an updated course. Because the course is always changing, because everything is always moving. That's what you need exposure for. Yes, it helps on a preventative measure, so you don't walk off a cliff and then blame the cliff. It's also so you don't get tricked by reality. Something you have found to be consistent 1,000 times to the point in your mind it's basically a truth. Tomorrow, the moment you need it to stay the same, you'll find the exception and everything will fall apart. In other words, you need as many experiences under your belt as possible. You need to deal with people daily, not only so you can continue LiDARing your surroundings and your world and building your schemas, but also so when you, do as I say, not as I do? When you've evolved to the point you can do the thing you tell other people not to do, you're doing it as safely as you can. Because in this zone, this dark zone, you can't even LiDAR those surroundings. You can only guess at what's there based on what you know. That's why you need to know as much as you can and stay up to date on it. Because there's not a way to know for sure what's out there, where you're trying to go. And we mentioned doubt earlier. There's another mortal aspect to INTP intuition that is on the higher end of powers one can attain if you are putting in the work. Let's think back for a moment. You, listening to this INTP, have walked off a cliff a number of times. First few times you blame the cliff. Next few times You did expose yourself to reality, believing that was enough, still walked off the cliff. Pissy, but now you're not blaming the cliff at least. You finally reached a point you are usually not walking off a cliff. But the fear of walking off the cliff is always there, and it's actually even worse than it was before because now you know if you walk off the cliff, it will be your fault alone. And I think that's why you doubt when you're unable to put things into words. Because you know, if you really knew it, and you might feel that you know it, and most of the time that feeling would be enough, but if you can't language it, then there's this suspicion that you don't really know it, even though maybe on some level you are aware there are things you can't put into words. There's still that fear, healthy fear, that you are missing something. So instead of pulling the trigger and taking the risk, you back off, you don't, and you go back into research mode. There are a few difficulties here. First, the smell of your suspicion that you're right isn't why you backed off, because it does smell right. Doubt is why you backed off. Why did you allow doubt to convince you to back off? Because when you were younger, every time you walked off the cliff, walking off the cliff smelled right. I think the way to look at this is two entities. One is a predictive computer. The other is a commander who makes the decision on whether or not to pull the trigger and listen to the computer's predictions or not. When the situation smells good, the computer thinks high certainty. The issue is the metric by which the computer measures certainty has nothing to do with reality, at least by default. So, if you've learned enough to know not to trust yourself by default, the safer play, because you haven't figured out how to work the computer yet, is not to pull the trigger on anything. Or maybe in a self-spiting sort of way, always doubt when something seems right to you. I think that's where you get these really... I don't like INTPs generally, but the extremely pathetic INTPs are the ones who have trained themselves never to trust themselves. That is the only schema they could build that they trust. Not to trust themselves. It's really pathetic. And don't try to save these people, by the way, or do, actually, if you want to learn something the hard way, because they're just as fucking anal as any other INTP is. It's just in an utterly self-negative way. That is the false truth they've learned to trust. And they trust, as with all INTPs, they trust themselves more than they'll ever trust anything else. And it is a hard hole for people like that to get out of, because if you never trust yourself, then it's sort of a liberation from responsibility. But it's not, though. Anyway, among more reasonable INTPs, you develop a healthy self-doubt. And having doubt is always useful, but once again, if you want to walk the plains, you'll need to find ways to deal with it. And the way you deal with it is experience, or at least that's the first part. You turn what you think should be, or think is, off, and allow the world to show you what is, in the worst ways possible. That's never a fun process because this is hell. Or maybe the world itself isn't hell, but it opens up terrifying, ego-threatening questions, such as, if this is what the world is, then why is nobody saying that's what it is? Why do people have 500,000 ideas about what the world is and what you should do in it, when what's actually happening is disempowerment, horror, betrayal, lying, terror, evil, relentless evil. But none of those aspects or questions matter. What matters is you are allowing existence to feed your computer the most unadulterated and up-to-date information as possible at all times. Then, maybe, when it comes to trying to figure out some puzzles, you trust your instincts, and they're right. Or it's a mixture of instincts and you work out the way things are in the way you used to. And you're almost reborn. You're back to learning patterns and puzzles, but now you're doing it not on an imaginary concrete foundation, but rather on top of like a platform that keeps itself level on sand. You're not on anything solid, but you're on a machine that can give you a semblance of solidity. And then, slowly over time, like an abused dog learning to trust again, you learn your instincts, your targeting computer is right. And not just can be right, but almost always is right. As long as you're feeding it unadulterated, up-to-date information about reality. And it's great, it's marvelous when you can get in touch with your computer this way, because it's not a yes-no thing. It'll give you, in an olfactorial way, give you percentage readings. This smells like a probably, but not a certainly. That smells like an I have no idea, but here are some clues to investigate. When you're staying in constant touch with ugly reality, your computer is the most reliable predictor there is. You build that trust. And that's when you can start getting into the planeswalking stuff, but we're still talking about the mortal things here, things you can apply. We mentioned puzzles earlier, and we mentioned troubleshooting, and we mentioned being able to guess what, in a partially completed puzzle, which puzzle pieces are supposed to go where, based on your knowledge of how these sorts of puzzles are supposed to work. When you, as an INTP, are operating at a high level, and you've built your trust in your own instincts, there are certain times, powers some consider to be unnatural, you can spot one thing that doesn't even look like a puzzle piece, realize it's a puzzle piece, and then intuit all the rest of the puzzle, all at once, based solely on your patterning. And these moments are freaky because in almost any other circumstance, if you even thought this, you'd think you're an asshole, and you're wrong. How on earth could you jump to that complete of a conclusion based on one piece of evidence that might not even be evidence? But once again, and that's like some trick shot shit, that's not something that's going to happen every day. But when you have this relationship with your instincts, and you've earned it, sometimes you can pull off trick shots, and you'll know you're at the point, you're floating, you're a Telvanni Magister, when you can not only draw one of these conclusions based on almost nothing, but, and then of course wait with bated breath to figure out if you were right or not, but right now, the moment you get the conclusion, take an action, and then later, of course, find out you were right, but then also reap the benefits. It's like you have the Back to the Future sports book without actually any time travel. It's wacky shit. I'll give you a brief example that happened today and frankly prompted this entire video because I wanted an excuse to flex. I walked by two dudes talking, and all I caught from their conversation as I passed them was, "This has been going on for a long time." And immediately I thought Epstein. I don't know why my mind went straight there, but I knew for certain, well, not for certain. I mean, I was doubting myself because this has been going on for a long time. Two strangers out in the open just talking. That's where your mind goes immediately. Maybe you're projecting, maybe you're overthinking this, but I had an excuse to be there for a little while longer. And their conversation continued for a little bit of coding going on, but then, yes, in fact, that is what they were talking about. But then through the work saga, my work saga, you can remember moments. Maybe you can remember moments. I'll mention things that I'll feel confident about, and then later they'll end up being true like that. I don't know why, but I think if I can figure out how to weather this, things, at least for a time, will end up where they're supposed to be, and then that's exactly what happened. Based on what? Based on nothing other than instinct. What you need to do is get yourself attuned with the truth of the world enough, dealing with people in circumstances, bad circumstances, directly enough. Your computer has perfect or as perfect as you can get information. Build that trust, and then really build that trust, and then you can start doing wacky shit that you shouldn't be able to do, based on your knowing it without knowing it. And yes, that principle, trying to know things without knowing them, is what leads to your failure and stagnation when you're young. And some people mock you, some people, in a patronizing way, encourage you to stop doing it, acting like they're doing you a favor, giving you good advice. And to a point they're giving you good advice, but what they're trying to do is they're trying to shackle you because that's what they've been told to do. They've been programmed by society to try to steer you away from things that could potentially make you powerful, and you feel inclined to listen to them because this strategy in your current state is getting you no results. So you stop doing it, and then you feel thankful to these people who are making you weak and dumb. Nobody ever talks about the necessary return to that space. It's the prodigal son shit. You need to go back to pants on head retardation if you intend to walk among the stars. But you need to return with the appropriate materials and understanding. Understanding of what the world is, and the ability to willingness to stay in constant touch with what the world is. Because there's no platform for you to stand on. You need to build your own platform and keep it level. But ultimately you will go back to assuming most things. And people will act like that's a regression because to the untrained eye or to the brainwashed eye, they look the same, and that's a bad thing, and a bad thing is always a bad thing. The difference is results, because when you return, if you've done it right, you will be getting results, where previously you got 0 results. That's why you need to learn to trust yourself, and you use results to build your trust in yourself. Because people won't aid you in this. People won't be happy that you're doing this, but you will get freak powers if you do it right. Long time ago, somebody mentioned, person mentioned, INTPs don't seem to be like cartographers. Knowing, or in Fallout, their primary stat, our primary stat, would not be intelligence. It would be perception. And that stuck with me because that's so penetratingly correct. Our ability is not to know everything, it's the ability to know which way the wind is blowing before it blows. And then develop the confidence, the self-belief to trust your assessment. You are a perceiver. Don't forget that. Yet another reason why standard functions typology shits all over socionics. Okay, video wasn't brief, but I got into it. I thought this was just going to be a holdover video because I originally, I think I said I have a real video cooking. This turned into a real video, and so we will cut it here. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't.